Working in a prison isn't for the faint of heart. The unpredictable nature of the inmates, the intense pressure to maintain order, and the constant awareness of danger are enough to wear anyone down. But what no one prepares you for is the sense of dread that comes when the walls themselves seem to watch you, whisper to you, and trap more than just the living. I've been a corrections officer for over 12 years, and I've worked in some of the oldest and most infamous facilities in the country. These prisons are more than just buildings, they're relics of a darker past, holding secrets of violence, despair, and death. One particular prison, where I spent 5 harrowing years, left a mark on me that I'll carry to my grave. The facility, built in the 1870s, was a massive structure of cold, gray stone surrounded by high walls that seemed to scrape the sky. Inside, narrow corridors stretched endlessly, lined with rusted cell bars that had housed countless men over the decades. Some of the wings had been shut down years ago, deemed unsafe or unnecessary. But even in the areas still in use, there was always a sense of something wrong. When I first started, I was warned by seasoned officers about the ghosts. They didn't speak of them in hushed tones or with the exaggerated flair of storytellers. Instead, their warnings were matter-of-fact, like discussing a dangerous inmate or a faulty piece of equipment. "You'll see things," one officer told me as we walked the yard during my first week. "And hear things. Just don't let it mess with your head." I brushed off their comments. I'm a rational person, not easily spooked, and I figured these stories were just part of the initiation for new officers. But then came the night that shattered my confidence. It was around 2 a.m., and I was assigned to monitor an inmate on suicide watch. My station was a small chair outside his cell, where I had to check on him every 15 minutes. The inmate was quiet, lying on his cot, his back to me. I shone my flashlight through the narrow window to ensure he was breathing. On one of my checks, I noticed something strange. In the corner of his cell, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, there was a figure, a tall, dark silhouette standing perfectly still. My heart leapt into my throat. I immediately radioed for backup, assuming someone had somehow gotten into the cell. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. The inmate stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes. He looked at me through the window and said something I'll never forget. "You saw him, didn't you?" I couldn't respond. My training told me to stay composed, but inside, I was shaken. The backup officers who arrived found nothing unusual, and the inmate refused to say anything more. A few weeks later, I was assigned to patrol one of the older, unused wings of the prison. This section had been closed off years ago but was still part of our routine checks to ensure no one had broken in. The air in this part of the prison was different, stale, heavy, and almost suffocating. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the echo of my boots on the cracked tile floor. As I turned a corner, I saw it, a shadow, darting across the hallway ahead of me. It was quick, almost too quick for me to process, but it was unmistakable. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a stray cat or a bird that had somehow gotten inside. But as I approached the spot where I'd seen the shadow, there was nothing there. Then I heard it, faint laughter, echoing down the hall. It was high-pitched, almost childlike, and completely out of place. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swept the beam across the empty cells. The sound seemed to move, coming from different directions, taunting me. I forced myself to finish my patrol, but every step felt heavier than the last. When I finally emerged back into the main area of the prison, I felt like I'd left something behind, like a part of me had stayed in that haunted wing. Perhaps the most chilling experience happened a few months later. It was late at night, and I was in the control room with another officer, reviewing surveillance footage. One of the monitors showed a corridor that was undergoing renovations. It was supposed to be empty, the lights turned off. But as we watched, the lights flickered on, one by one, illuminating the hallway in a slow, deliberate sequence. At first, We thought it was an electrical issue. Then a figure appeared on the screen, a man dressed in an old-fashioned prison uniform, the kind that hadn't been worn in decades. He walked slowly down the corridor, his head bowed, his movements deliberate. We watched in stunned silence as he reached the end of the hallway and walked through the wall. My colleague and I stared at each other, both pale and speechless. We rewound the footage to make sense of what we'd just seen, but when we played it back, the figure was gone. The lights were off, and the corridor was empty. Over the years, these experiences piled up. There were nights when I heard whispers coming from empty cells, voices murmuring just out of earshot. Objects would move on their own, keys sliding across a desk, doors creaking open despite being locked. One time, during a power outage, I was tasked with ensuring all inmates were accounted for. The emergency lights cast long, eerie shadows, and the prison felt more like a tomb than ever. As I walked past one cell, I saw a face staring back at me, a gaunt, hollow-eyed face pressed against the bars. I jumped back, my heart pounding, but when I looked again, the cell was empty. I don't know what lingers in that prison, whether it's the spirits of those who died there, the residual energy of countless acts of violence and despair, or just the product of an overworked mind. But I do know this. Some places carry their history in ways we can't always understand. Working there changed me. It taught me to respect the unknown, to listen to the stories told not just by people, but by the walls and the air itself. And while I've moved on to a different facility, I'll never forget the haunted halls of that old prison, and the feeling that, even now, something is still watching me.